Tonight, one of this century's most ambitious projects at the largest reservoir in the nation, which looked like this in 2000. Take a look at what it looks like now. It was so low it could become useless to communities that rely on it. Instead of looking to the sky, engineers are looking miles beneath the surface to get water by essentially pulling the plug of the nation's biggest bathtub.
Right now, hundreds of feet beneath the surface of Nevada's largest reservoir, a machine that cost roughly $1.5 billion is pulling water out of the dark. Engineers bored it straight through the rock beneath the lakebed for a single reason: to keep one desert city alive after the water drops below the level where the Hoover Dam itself stops working. These photos from the UNLV Library Special Collections and Archives show the water overflow from the Arizona side of the dam in August of 1983. A flood that summer sent record flows into Lake Mead. The water level on Lake Mead has dropped 130 feet since the late 1990s. What does that mean? That means the surface used to be up there at the top of what they call the bathtub ring. Las Vegas started building this lifeline 20 years ago, betting the largest reservoir in the United States would keep shrinking, and it has. What that bet is racing against is a threshold near the bottom of the lake that nobody upstream wants to reach. The warning on the walls. There is a white ring running around the walls of Lake Mead. From a boat, it looks like a bathtub that hasn't been scrubbed in years. Pale mineral deposits baked into the rock by decades of desert sun, marking the old water line of a lake that used to reach far higher than it does today. From above, that ring reads like a scar.
These photos from the UNLV Library Special Collections and Archives show the water overflow from the Arizona side of the dam in August of 1983. A flood that summer sent record flows into Lake Mead.
The water level on Lake Mead has dropped 130 feet since the late 1990s. What does that mean? That means the surface used to be up there at the top of what they call the bathtub ring.
Warning, because every inch of pale rock between the top of that ring and the water below it is water that used to be there and isn't anymore. Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the United States. It was last full in 1983. It has not been full since, and the experts who study it say it would now take years of heavy winters, one after another, just to begin replacing what has already drained away. Think of the reservoir as a bank account that the entire American Southwest has been overdrawing for decades. Since the year 2000, the water level has fallen by roughly 160. Fort the lake that once held 26 million acre-feet, enough to bury the entire state of Pennsylvania under a foot of water, now holds around 8 million, roughly 30% of what it was designed to carry. That is not an abstract number. Around 25 million people depend on this single body of water. Las Vegas draws 90% of everything that comes out of its taps directly from this lake. The farms of Arizona and California pull from the same source. So does a large stretch of northern Mexico. And Hoover Dam, the structure that created the lake in the first place, spins its turbines on the same water. In 1922, we negotiated a compact, an interstate water compact with the other 6 states on the river, generating electricity for homes and businesses across 3 states. As the water has dropped, so has the power. Hoover Dam's output has fallen by about a third since the lake was last healthy, and the lake is still dropping. At the very bottom of this reservoir, there is a threshold with a name that sounds like something out of fiction: Deadpool. At 895 feet above sea level, the water sits too low to pass through the dam at all. No flow downstream, no hydropower, nothing on the far side. For the cities and farms that built their entire existence around what comes out of the other side of Hoover Dam, Deadpool is not an engineering term. It is an existential one. Las Vegas saw this coming. 2 decades ago, the city placed a $1.5 billion bet that the lake would keep falling, and it built something to survive that fall. A machine buried at the bottom of the reservoir, reaching for water below the level where everyone else's supply gives out. It is running right now, today, while the lake sits at depths it has not seen since the 1930s. We will get to exactly how deep it reaches and what it costs to build. But first, you have to see how the river fell far enough to need it. And that starts with what was built here in the first place: the marvel in Black Canyon. In 1931, the United States was in the depths of the Great Depression. 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Banks were failing, and the federal government was desperate for projects big enough to put serious numbers of people back on a payroll. What it chose to build in the Nevada desert was audacious, and plenty of engineers at the time were not sure it could be done at all. The Colorado River had been flooding and wrecking communities across the Southwest for generations. Violent in spring, nearly dry by late summer, unmanageable at any real scale, the Bureau of Reclamation had been studying a dam site in Black Canyon on the Nevada and Arizona border since the early 1920s. What came out of those studies was Hoover Dam. Unlike anything ever attempted in the country before, construction began in 1931. At the peak, more than Around 5,000 men were on site, working in canyon temperatures that regularly pushed past 120 degrees. They lived in Boulder City, a town raised from nothing in the desert just to house them. Over 5 years, they poured 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to lay a 2-lane highway from New York to San Francisco. When it was finished in 1936, it was the largest concrete structure ever built by human hands. 726 foot tall, 1,244 feet wide across the crest, holding back a reservoir that ran 112 miles into the desert. That reservoir is Lake Mead. At full capacity, Lake Mead holds 26.1 million acre-feet. A single acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons, which puts the full lake at just under 9 trillion gallons. Try that another way. It is enough water to supply every household in the United States for well over a decade. Before the dam, the Colorado was a seasonal problem to survive. After it, the river became the water supply for Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Diego. Cities that could never have grown to their size without the water and power coming out of this one structure in the rock. Hoover makes that power by funneling lake water through its turbines before releasing it downstream. Around 4 billion quart-hours a year at full pool, enough for more than 1 million homes. The split runs roughly 55% to California, 25% to Nevada, 20% to Arizona, on lines that reach communities hundreds of miles away. It was more than infrastructure, though, built by men earning around 50 cents an hour in conditions that killed 96 of them. It became a symbol of what the country could still pull off when everything else was falling apart. Franklin Roosevelt hailed it as a wonder of the age, and roughly 1 million people a year still stand on its crest to look down into the canyon. For the communities below it, Hoover was never a tourist stop. It is the reason they exist where they do. When the dam was completed in 1936, Las Vegas held around 8,000 people. Today, the metro area holds 2.2 million, and it draws 90% of its municipal water straight from Lake Mead. Take away the lake, and the city stops functioning. The same dependency runs across the whole region. The Colorado system supplies roughly 40 million people across 7 states, dozens of tribal nations, and a slice of northern Mexico. Arizona's Yuma Valley, which grows most of America's winter vegetables, drinks from it. So does much of Southern California. All of it originates upstream and passes through or is stored by the infrastructure Hoover anchors. For decades, the whole thing worked exactly as designed. The lake filled, the turbines spun, and the Southwest grew up around one quiet assumption, that the supply was permanent and effectively without limit. That assumption is where the trouble was hiding, because the river everything was built around was never quite the river that actually existed. If you are finding this useful, take a second to subscribe before we go on, because the next part is where the whole system quietly cracked. What comes next is the accounting error that everything after it was built on top of, and it was written into law before the dam was even finished. The number that never existed. On November 24, 1922, representatives from 7 states gathered at the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and signed an agreement dividing the Colorado River between them. The Colorado River Compact handed 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year to the upper basin states, which were Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. It handed another 7.5 million to the lower basin states, Arizona, Nevada, and California. A separate treaty later granted Mexico 1.5 million acre-feet a year. In total, the paperwork promised 16.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River water every single year in perpetuity to the people drawing from it. There was just one problem, and it was buried in the measurements. Water from Lake Mead flowed in through the intake towers to turbines, which in turn rotated generators, producing such a massive amount of electricity that by 1987 the power produced completely paid for the dam. The negotiators had based their entire division on river flow data recorded between 1906 and 1929, one of the wettest stretches in the river's entire recorded history. They had measured a fluke and treated it as normal. The actual long-term average flow of the Colorado measured across centuries of tree ring and climate data is closer to 13.5 million acre-feet a year. What the states carved up between themselves was never what the river reliably delivered. And in recent decades, it has delivered far less than even that. Since the year 2000, the river's average annual flow has been running around 12 million acre-feet. The state's tribes in Mexico all hold legal rights to 16.5 million, which means that every single year, roughly a quarter of the promised water simply does not exist. It was never there. It was a number on a page. That gap has to come from somewhere. For the past 2 decades, it has come out of Lake Mead, which quietly covers the shortfall by draining its own stored water to make up the difference. The problem is simple. That stored water has been running out. The decline started gradually. In 2000, Lake Mead sat at roughly 1,200 feet above sea level near its historical peak. By 2004, it had slipped below the 1,150. By 2010, 2010, below 1,100. Each dry year took a little more. Each wet year gave back a little less music, and the trend only moved in one direction. By 2016, the lake had fallen below 1,080 feet, triggering the first formal shortage warnings from federal water managers. By 2021, it crossed below 1,075, the threshold at which the Bureau of Reclamation officially declares a Tier 1 shortage and imposes mandatory cuts on Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. Arizona, holding the most junior water rights in the lower basin, absorbed the largest cuts. Farms that had irrigated with Colorado River water for generations were told flatly that their share was being reduced. Then, in 2022, the lake hit 1,041 feet, its lowest level since the reservoir was first filled back in the 1930s. Boat ramps that had operated for decades sat stranded on dry, cracked ground hundreds of feet from the nearest water. Marinas shut down. The pale bathtub ring stretched 160 feet above the surface. And as the water pulled back, it began giving up things that had been hidden beneath it for half a century. A World War II-era landing craft, sunken houseboats, and disturbingly a human body sealed inside a barrel. The drought driving all of this had been building for more than 20 years. Scientists studying tree rings and other climate records have concluded that this is the most severe dry period the region has seen in at least 1,200 years. The official term for it is mega drought. It is not a bad season that resolves in a year or two. It is a fundamental shift in the region's hydrology sharpened by rising temperatures that evaporate more water off the lake surface, dry out the soil faster, and shrink the mountain snowpack that feeds the river each spring. Colorado River flows this century have run about 30% below the flows recorded during the window when the 1922 compact numbers were set. The delegates in Santa Fe knew their numbers were generous, but the agreement was signed anyway because the alternative, 7 states failing to reach any deal, would have blocked Hoover Dam entirely. The compact was the price of the dam, and for decades the dam was worth it. But the accounting deferred in 1922 is now coming due. The only question left is how far the lake has to fall before the bill lands. And there are thresholds waiting below the surface that make the shortage tiers look gentle. The thresholds below the water Lake Mead is managed through a tiered system of shortages. Each tier marks a point where the Bureau of Reclamation has decided the reservoir can no longer support full deliveries. As the water drops past each line, the cuts get deeper. At 1,075 feet, the Bureau declares a formal Tier 1 shortage. Arizona loses 512,000 acre-feet from its annual allocation, an 18% cut. Nevada loses 21,000. Mexico loses 41,000. The lake has been sitting below that first line since 2020, and it is now close enough to breach the next one. At 150 feet, the cuts deepen again. At 1,035 feet, the system reaches its Tier 3 shortage. And this is the first line that really matters for power, because once the lake falls below 1,035 feet, 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines can no longer operate. Generating capacity drops from more than 1,300 megawatt to around 382. That is roughly a 70% collapse in the dam's ability to make electricity. And it lands on households across the entire basin, pushed below 1,000 feet, and the whole Colorado River infrastructure moves into genuine risk of a system-wide failure. But hold on to this. These tears only redistribute scarcity. They shuffle a shrinking pool between states, farms, and cities. They do not create a single new drop. And below them lie two thresholds of a completely different category. At 950 feet, Lake Mead reaches what is called minimum power pool. At that level, the water surface sits too low to reach Hoover Dam's turbine intakes at all. The 4 billion kilowatt-hours a year that flow out of Black Canyon simply stop. And then at the very bottom, at 895 feet, comes dead pool. Below that line, the water falls too low to pass through Hoover Dam's outlet works by gravity. The dam can no longer release water downstream. The Colorado River on the far side of the dam stops receiving its supply. For the cities, the farms, the tribal communities, and the 40 million people whose entire water systems were built around the assumption that this river keeps flowing. Dead pool is the end of the line. The lake is currently around 160 feet above dead pool. And that might sound like a comfortable cushion until you remember one number. In the year 2000, the lake sat 330 feet above dead pool. It has covered half that distance in just 25 years. The trajectory is not bending back, and the forces driving it down, reduced river flows, rising temperatures, and a legal framework that promises more water than the river carries. None of them have been solved. There is one more piece of engineering that makes this worse than the raw water level suggests. Hoover Dam's intake towers were designed in the 1930s to draw water from fixed depths inside the reservoir. As the lake has fallen, those fixed intakes have become less and less effective. In 2022, the uppermost intake on the Nevada side was briefly left exposed above the waterline entirely. The dam is physically constrained by where its pipes were built, regardless of what any shortage tier says says on paper. So, in a race against the clock, the authorities tried to change the math. And in 2026, the clock nearly beat them. The year the clock ran out, the negotiations between the 7 basin states of music had been grinding along in one form or another for more than a decade. In 2026, they finally ran out of time. To understand why, you have to understand how the whole system is fed. The Colorado River works from the top down. Snow falls in the Rocky Mountains through the winter. It melts in spring. The runoff pours into the upper river, fills Lake Powell behind Glen Canyon Dam in northern Arizona, and from there gets released downstream into Lake Mead. Snow, melt, flow, fill. That cycle is what keeps both reservoirs alive. In the winter of 2025 into 2026, the snowpack in the Rockies came in at record lows. Then, a heat wave in March arrived before the snow had properly melted, burning off what little runoff the mountains had left to give. Lake Powell dropped faster than any projection had anticipated. And here the system revealed a brutal internal logic. Glen Canyon Dam, just like Hoover, only generates power when the water behind it sits above a minimum threshold. With Powell falling fast, the Department of the Interior faced a decision with no good options. It could keep releasing water downstream into Lake Mead, holding Hoover's input steady, or it could hold water back inside Powell to protect Glen Canyon's own power, accepting that less would reach me. In April 2026, it chose to protect Powell. The release into Lake Mead was cut by 1.48 million acre-feet for the year. The Bureau of Reclamation acknowledged plainly that the decision could accelerate the decline of Lake Mead downstream, including a possible 40% reduction in Hoover Dam's hydropower capacity as early as that fall. Hoover's output had already fallen by a third over the previous 2 decades. A further 40% cut would leave the dam producing roughly a quarter of what it made when the lake was healthy. Then, in May 2026, the Bureau released a 24-month study projecting that Lake Mead could fall to 1,021 feet by the summer of 2027. That would shatter the 2022 record low by more than 20 feet. The people feeling this first are the farmers of Arizona. Picture one of them standing at the edge of a field at the end of the season. A 4th-generation grower on land, his family has irrigated with Colorado River water for 100 years. Looking out at ground, he was told this year he can no longer water. The rows behind him that once held cotton, alfalfa, and winter vegetables are bare dirt now. The Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal that carries river water to Phoenix, Tucson, and the farms of Central Arizona, has been delivering reduced allocations for years. Some growers have lost their surface water supply entirely. The towns built around those farms are shrinking right along with the fields. California, meanwhile, has faced no mandatory cuts at all. The compact promises the state 4.44 million acre-feet a year, rights protected by seniority until the lake drops to a threshold it has not yet reached. But when it does reach that threshold, the legal fight over California's share will dwarf every water dispute the American West has ever seen. The 7 states were supposed to have a new long-term management framework agreed by February 2026, replacing the interim rules that expire at the end of the year. They missed the deadline. In May, Arizona, California, and Nevada put forward a joint proposal to leave more water in the system through 2028. The upper basin states did not sign on. The details of exactly where the cuts would land had never been worked out, and nothing concrete has materialized since. Every short-term extension the states have negotiated over the past 20 years has done the same thing. Bought time without ever closing the gap between what the river delivers and what the paperwork promises. The lake has dropped through every one of them, and the room for another is narrower now than it has ever been, which is exactly the future one city decided long ago it would not gamble on. While everyone else waited for the states to agree, Las Vegas quietly started digging. The city that saw it coming. When people picture what is draining Lake Mead, Las Vegas comes to mind first. The Strip, the fountains, the hotels running around the clock, the golf courses carved improbably into the Mojave. A city built on spectacle in the middle of the desert pulling from a shrinking lake. Surely, Las Vegas is a huge part of the problem. The numbers say otherwise. Southern Nevada's entire annual allocation from the Colorado River is just 300,000 acre-feet. Arizona receives 8 times that. California receives 13 times more. And agriculture across the Southwest consumes roughly 70% of all Colorado River water. Las Vegas accounts for a small fraction of what a single farming region uses in a year. On top of that, the city built on excess is one of the most water-efficient large urban systems in North America. And for the past 2 decades, while the state negotiations stalled and the lake kept falling, it has been spending heavily to stay that way. That effort came in 4 parts. The first part was conservation, and it started with grass. Ornamental lawns that nobody walked on required constant irrigation, evaporated water that could never be recovered and existed almost entirely for the way they looked. So, the state started paying people to tear them out. Homeowners received $3 for every every square foot of decorative grass they removed and replaced with desert landscaping. Since 1999, some 250 million square feet have been pulled up, saving roughly 203 billion gallons of water. The work is nearly finished, and by 2027, all non-functional grass in the city will be banned from using Colorado River water at all. The results are hard to argue with. Between 2002 and 2024, Southern Nevada cut its per capita water use by 55% while adding 829,000 new residents. The metropolitan area grew by nearly 1 million people and still used less total water than it did before those people ever arrived. The second part was recycling. Nearly all of the water Las Vegas uses indoors is treated and returned to Lake Mead. The city receives credit for every gallon it sends back. So indoor use is effectively recycled, not lost. Gross withdrawals from the lake run close to 600,000 acre-feet a year, but net consumption stays right at the 300,000 acre-foot allocation limit. Half of everything the city draws comes straight back. The third part is where the real money went, and it is the part that gives this whole story its title. The tunnel under the Lake Las Vegas had 2 intake pipes drawing water from Lake Mead. Both were built when the reservoir was reliably full. Engineered for a lake nobody ever expected to fall this far. As the water level dropped through the 2000s, the Water Authority's engineers reached a simple, alarming conclusion. At some point, the existing intakes would rise clean above the waterline, left sucking at air while the lake retreated below them. So, in 2005, the board approved a third intake. They set aside $812 million for it, and construction began in 2008. The plan was to drill a new intake far deeper than the others from below. Picture the crew who dug it. Nearly 3 kilometers in from the shaft, hundreds of feet down, a handful of men stand inside a bore 24 feet across, beneath the floor of an active reservoir. Above their heads is not rock, but water. Millions of tons of it, pressing down through fault lines that leak and flood without warning. The boring machine grinds forward through hard rock 1 hour and through saturated waterlogged ground the next. There is no daylight, no fast way out. And the lake they are working under is the same lake the entire city is fighting to keep. The finished tunnel ran 4.7 kilometers, feeding an intake structure anchored to the very bottom of the reservoir with more than 1,000 truckloads of concrete. Tunneling ran from 2011 to 2014. The intake structure lowered to the lake floor weighs over 1,200 tons. Among tunneling engineers, this was regarded as one of the most technically demanding projects completed anywhere on Earth that decade. It collected engineering awards from organizations in the United States, Switzerland, and Britain. Intake number 3 began operating in September 2015. It reached far deeper than the old pipes, but there was a catch built into it. It still shared pumping infrastructure with the original intakes, which limited its operation to water levels above 1,000 feet, so the Water Authority went further and built a dedicated pumping station to push past that limit. The low lake level pumping station was completed in 2020 and switched on in April 2022 at the exact moment the falling lake rendered one of the original pumping stations inoperable. It came in under its $650 million budget at $522 million, and it can move up to 900 million gallons a day. Together, the third intake and the new pumping station reach water sitting at 875 feet above sea level. Read that number against the one from earlier. Deadpool is 895 feet. This system reaches water 20 feet below Deadpool, which means that if Lake Mead falls to the point where Hoover Dam can no longer release a single drop downstream, where Arizona and California and Mexico lose their supply entirely, Las Vegas can still draw water from what remains of the lake. The total cost of the intake system came to roughly $1.5 billion. It is the most direct answer any city drawing from Lake Mead has given to the question of what happens when the water just keeps falling. And there was a fourth part quieter than the rest: underground storage through artificial recharge programs. Southern Nevada has spent years injecting treated water down into local aquifers, banking it for later. Across projects in Nevada, Arizona, California, and inside Lake Mead itself, the Water Authority has stored more than 2.22 million acre-feet, a hidden reserve to draw on when the lake drops fastest or the cuts bite deepest. Las Vegas has done more to prepare for a shrinking lake than any other city that depends on it. The conservation gains are real. The recycling loop works. The third intake reaches below Deadpool, and yet none of it makes the Colorado River carry a single gallon more than it actually holds, which leaves the hardest question of all still hanging. What happens when the lake falls past the point that even the best preparation can reach? What engineering cannot fix? Despite everything Las Vegas has built, Lake Mead remains around a third full, and the broader Colorado River system keeps grinding under the same three pressures: drought, a warming climate, and decades of promising more water than the river could ever give. The engineers are not finished either. On May 21, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation announced it was spending $52 million on Hoover Dam itself on 3 new turbines built to solve the power problem. problem. The old turbines cannot generate meaningful power once the lake drops below 1,035 feet. Below that, capacity falls off a cliff from more than 1,300 megawatt down to 382. So, they are being replaced with wide-head turbines designed to keep spinning all the way down to 950 feet, the minimum power pool line through conditions the original designers never imagined. Look at what these two projects have in common. The Las Vegas third intake reaches below dead pool. The new turbines keep the dam generating through conditions that would have shut down the old ones. Both are engineering responses to a lake that keeps falling, but neither one is a response to why it keeps falling. They buy time. They do not buy water. And not every community downstream has a Las Vegas-sized answer. Phoenix draws from the Central Arizona Project Canal, already delivering reduced allocations year after year. When California's seniority threshold is finally crossed, the fight over its share will be the most consequential water dispute the West has ever seen. And Mexico, which receives 1.5 million acre-feet a year under a 1944 treaty, has no backup at all. A dead pool that delivery stops. The farms of the Mexicali Valley, which feed millions of people on both sides of the border, have no alternative source to turn to. The bathtub ring on Lake Mead's walls marks 160 feet of water that used to be music there and is now simply gone. At the rate the lake has been declining, averaging 6 to 7 feet a year across the past 2 decades, the distance to dead pool is measured not in centuries, but in decades, possibly less. It depends entirely on what the Rocky Mountains produce in the winters ahead and on whether 7 states can finally agree to use less water than a document from 1922 says they are entitled to take, because Lake Mead in the end is only a symptom. The lake is not the disease.